So I'm excited to introduce today John Cooper and Elizabeth Bourne. John has lived and worked for 10 years in France, Quebec, and French-speaking Switzerland. He has taught French at Oakland University and is the creator and narrator of French Detroit History Cruise. He's a board member of the Alliance Française de Detroit, board member of Residence Richelieu de Windsor, and member organizing committee for La Rendez-vous de Detroit. Elizabeth Bourne's knowledge of French history and culture stems from her family background, with family documented records dating back all the way to the 1600s in France. Two of her ancestors were part of Cadillac's 1701 founding convoy of Detroit. Pretty cool. She is also a direct descendant of Jean Coste de Saint-Aubin. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I certainly tried, for whom the street in downtown Detroit is named. Ms. Bourne is the creator and chair of the Rendez-vous de Detroit, an annual cultural event which celebrates Detroit's French, Canadian, and Native American roots. And so now, before I throw it to John and Elizabeth, I know the burning question on everybody's mind that I'm sure they'll answer today is it pronounced Detroit, Detroit, or Detroit? John, Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Bonjour, je m'appelle John Cooper.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Elizabeth Bourne, and we're here to tell you about the French foundations of Detroit.
And we think this picture is a nice place to start because Le Détroit means the strait in French. And if you see this picture, aerial picture of Detroit, Belle Isle and the bridge there, you can see it is a strait linking Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. And that is exactly what Mr. Cadillac, when he arrived in 1701, gave the name to the fort. And even if you look at the flag of Detroit, visible on this image here, the bottom left-hand corner has the French fleur-de-lis symbols. And those were the type of flags that flew over Detroit. The one to the left, the French flag we all know today, never did. That only occurred after the Revolution. So we're here to tell you about these foundations, and people say, Detroit? Well, it was the way that Cadillac named the fort. So what we'd like to explain a little bit too is the music we've been playing is music that has been gathered along the Detroit River by a friend of ours, whom we will see now. He made it his mission to gather the old French songs along both sides of the river. And his name is Marcel Beneteau, and we will see right here, he gathered thousands of these songs. He's a musicologist, retired now, but he gathered thousands of these songs and actually recorded hundreds of them himself, speaking to various elderly people along the river, on both sides of the river, the old French people, and put together what he called the old songs of Detroit. You can see it here, les vieilles chansons de Détroit, the old songs of the strait, if you want to translate it that way. And he actually performs at our regular French-Canadian Native American cultural event every year. And it's important to note that this was the flag down that we see below here that was actually used here in Detroit for the years that the French controlled the area. So the French are still here, actually. People say, oh, where'd the French go? They are still here, but because they were the first Europeans here, they're the ones that are the most assimilated. So they're probably the hardest ones to find. Okay? But what really do we see of Detroit from the French days here? There's a lot of things. A lot of times we just don't see it. And one thing is, we recognize the map of the area here. You really can't separate Detroit and its foundings from Windsor across the river. And a lot of these names that maybe you pronounce one way, because that's the way we do it in English, but the original names were somewhat different. We'll give you a little run through here.
Belle Isle.
Belle-Île.
Grosse-Île.
Grosse-Île.
Grosse Point.
Grosse Pointe.
Cadillac.
Cadillac.
Gratiot.
Ratio.
Dequinder.
Déquindre.
Hamtramck. Rivard.
Rivard.
Saint-Aubin.
Saint-Aubin.
Beaubien.
Beaubien.
Saint-Antoine.
Saint-Antoine.
Riopelle.
Riopelle.
Orleans.
Orléans.
Campo.
Campo.
Dubois.
Dubois.
Shane.
Chêne.
Livernois.
Livernois. So which one is right and which one is wrong? Hey, we're Americans. We speak our American English. We have no shames about it, but at least know where these names come from. Okay? So where were the French here? If we overlay the map, the original map of Detroit, at least this one here shows about 1765, you can begin to see that the first fort of Detroit, known as Fort Pontchartrain of Detroit of Lake Erie, the original name, the first fort was built right along in front of where the TCF Center is today, along Jefferson Avenue. Right across the river, later there was the Ottawa Village, there were the Potawatomis, there were the Hurons, and the French who came. Everybody wanted to have space along the river because that was the only transportation. Remember, there were no roads, there were no railroads, there was nothing. To have trade and transport and have a living, you had to be along the river. Okay? So we always go back to Cadillac. Cadillac started the city of Detroit in 1701. We'll just look at the timeline here. And he named it, by the way, Fort Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain was his boss back in Paris, who was the minister in charge of the Navy and colonies, and he was a good brown nose, and so he said, I'll name the fort after my boss, and Fort Pontchartrain of the Strait of Lake Erie. So Detroit means the Strait. But if we look at the whole timeline of the French, where do they go? Well, they're still here, but they were assimilated. The last bit, and if we look at the bottom here, 1887, the French community built the last French landmark, a beautiful complex of buildings out now in what is the west end of Detroit, near the bridge. Beautiful set of buildings. And but when did the first French originally come here? Well, it goes back from before the Great Fire of Detroit in 1805, and it goes back to even 1610. Etienne Brulé was the first Frenchman to come through, the first European to explore around the Great Lakes. Quite a notable guy this young man was. He took off and learned a bunch of Indian languages and was later discovered and used as a guide by later French explorers. Here at the Strait, there was a French trading post established for a while, and that took place in the spring of 1620. Why is that important? Because it even is before the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock. So really, the European presence here in North America predates the Pilgrims in Plymouth Rock. Okay? Later, two famous Frenchmen, Jesuits, came through, Jean de Brébeuf and Chaumonot, and they erected a large cross and pronounced this is a land for all peoples. You can find this among the old Jesuit records of the early explorers. That's available in Paris these days. Later, the first ship ever to navigate on the Great Lakes was built above Niagara Falls, and on Lake Erie is called Le Griffon, the Griffin, and La Salle, the famous explorer, and Hennepin, after whom the north point of Grosse Ile is named, Hennepin Point, and came through the strait. But later, you have to understand, the French were here until 1760, and they lost the war to the British, and the British took possession of all that is New France today, including Detroit. But there was a little thing that happened, we won't talk about it too much, the American Revolution, American independence, and it led to the U.S. and the U.K. drawing a border, and they had to draw a border somewhere, and it kind of arbitrarily ended up in the middle of the Detroit River. So it turned out that this community that was on both sides of the river had a line drawn through the middle of it, and the larger number of people were on the north side of the river in Detroit, and the south side eventually became Windsor. So what happened later? Michigan became a state in 1837, and the last landmark, the oldest landmark on the other side of the river is this beautiful Church of the Assumption in Windsor. So it was a daughter church of St. Anne's in Detroit. But now there's a border and a big invisible line in the middle of the Detroit River that separates the two. So it gives you a little context here. Right? Who was this guy Cadillac? I've had the the privilege of being able to visit his hometown 4 times in the last few years, and gotten to know the people who run the Cadillac Museum there, a little tiny place that was his birthplace, that in fact the city of Detroit paid to save and renovate back in the 1960s. And I was welcomed with open arms as the guy from Detroit when I got there. But Cadillac was an explorer and an entrepreneur, and he was given the charge of looking after the French fort in Michilimackinac, up at the north end of Michigan. He befriended the local Indians, the Hurons, the Odawas, and the Potawatomis that had been displaced from the Strait of Detroit a couple generations earlier. Their ancestors had lost a war to the fierce Iroquois, and they wanted to go back to Detroit. Cadillac saw an opportunity. These people wanted to go back to their homelands, and he wanted to trade furs with them. So he got permission from the King of France to set up with these Indian nations at Detroit and to set up a multi-ethnic, mutually beneficial commercial enterprise for the fur trade. Why? The Indians could gather furs, especially beaver furs, which were all the rage in Europe, and the Europeans could provide manufactured goods that the Indians couldn't make, steel, pots, pans, these type of advanced technology. So it was a mutually beneficial trade between the two of them. And at the same time, the French built a fort, as you can see on the right, which became Fort Pontchartrain, and it was used there to help protect the natives from their enemies. Right? Quick view of what North America looked like around 1750. You can see the French claimed control over this huge center part of the country. And the Great British only controlled and claimed the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. So you can see what happened when the French lost the war in 1760 to the British. All that blue territory, at least above Louisiana, became under British control. Okay? So what happened? How did the French get to Michigan? And we have to go back that most French coming to Michigan did not come directly from France, but they came to Canada in a period of about 150 years long. And really the number of immigrants were not that many from France to Canada. It was only about 10,000 of them, but they propagated and had large families, and they became quite numerous. By the time the French lost the war to the British in 1760, this immigration stopped. And there were about 50,000 French speakers in North America, but most of them had been born and raised, and they were Canadians. So that happened during this time, and no more French immigration took place, at least not in large numbers. What did happen was, during the period from the middle 1800s to the middle 1900s, large numbers of Canadians, more than 2 million Canadians crossed the border to work in the United States, and almost half of those were French Canadians. So most of the French Canadians we have in Michigan today came to work either in the forestry industries in the 1800s or in the auto industry in the early 1900s. So they didn't come from France. The French names that we see, and there are so many of them here in Michigan, came through Canada, and they came to Canada more than 300 years ago. So what did they do when they came here? This is a shot of the Fort Pontchartrain of Detroit. This is what Cadillac built when he came here, and it was initially a trading post and to help protect the native peoples. As you can see, the teepees and the native housing there. And it was built very close to the river. You can see you wanted to have a river with a cannon that you could control trade. They wanted to keep the British from getting into the upper Great Lakes. And they succeeded in doing so. And here's an aerial site of Detroit today. The original site of Fort Pontchartrain is right in front of the TCF Center, former Cobo Hall. And it's right where the Crown Plaza Hotel is, and there's a big plaque there you can go see. It was originally closer to the river, but the river was narrowed in order to create more land along during the past few centuries. So, what did they do here? You can see now an old French map, and this is where Fort Pontchartrain was built, and the various Indian villages across River Ottawa. They wanted them to be close, but not too close. You don't want to be too close to your neighbors. Close enough to trade, but far enough away so you had the space. This is the Potawatomi, and this is the Huron. This is where the bridge goes today. And in fact, the Huron is right here known as the Assumption Church is on Huron Church Drive. But streets have been left in other places, and I'll let Elizabeth explain to us a little bit more about this.
Thanks, John. Are these the highlighted ones?
No.
So once the fort was established, there was land made available to the farmers. And these strips of land, they were called the French ribbon farms. And if you can see the highlighted names at the left of your screen, there's the St. Aubin name, and then down below is the Chauvin name. And I'm a descendant of each of these families. You've probably heard of St. Aubin Street in downtown Detroit, and so that was where their ribbon farm was. And because the Detroit River was the main highway, everybody wanted to have, footage, river frontage right on the main highway. And so the ribbon farms were usually about 250 feet of river frontage, and then usually between a mile and a half to 3 miles long. And the farms were typical farms. The women all had kitchen gardens where they grew, fresh vegetables and herbs. They had pigs and chickens that they later brought in, so they always had, fresh poultry. The French ate a lot of pork, so they had pigs. The men also did a lot of hunting and fishing to supplement their diet. Another thing that you might find interesting about the French women of Detroit, they were never more than 6 months to a year behind the latest fashions of Paris. Madame Cadillac and her good friend Madame Tonty, they always had the latest fashions. And someone earlier had mentioned my hat. I don't know if they can see me or not. Okay. So a typical farm wife, she would generally wear a skirt with the French bodice and a chemise, which is like a blouse. They always wore a hat. And this would be a typical hat that they would wear during the 18th century. It had a low crown like this. For dressier occasions, they would have something like what I am wearing today. Chintz was a very popular fabric, and so the dresses were generally made out of a cotton chintz or silk, which also these fabrics were used in trade goods with the Indians. And this made actually life a lot easier for Indian women because they no longer had to rely on tanning hides to make their clothing, so they loved, trading and getting cotton and silk fabrics. The laces all came from France, and so they just stand up so they can see my dress. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this would be a typical dress with a petticoat underneath. These beads that I have on have been in my family for almost 200 years, and they're a carved wood. But beads were, of course, traded with the Indians and very popular. So the women of Detroit were always very interested in fashion. That never went away. So how I'm related to the Chauvin and the St. Aubin family is that my seventh great-grandfather, his name was Jean Casse-Diet St. Aubin, and he had a daughter, Marie Anne, and she married Charles Chauvin. And so there was a marriage there, and so that's why my ancestry covers those two families and also goes back to the original convoy.
And one thing you've probably noticed is these long ribbon farms are what drew these streets that have the names of the farmers associated with them. So when you see Joseph Campo, and Riopel Street, etc., these were streets that ran along the edges of the farms. That's how it all started. So what happened to the French language here in Detroit? When the French arrived, Cadillac and Company in 1701, 1760, you heard French was the dominant language. The Indians had a number of languages of their own. And from even after the British took over in 1760, the French was the dominant language. There was a few British soldiers, a few administrators, but French was still the dominant language. However, in the middle of the 1820s, the Erie Canal opened up, and it opened up the Great Lakes to easy and inexpensive immigration by waves of European immigrants. So people from Ireland and Germany and England came through the Great Lakes and began to quickly outnumber the French. Starting from about 1840, French was a minority language on the Detroit side of the river. And one way you can mark the end of the French language, the last regular church service in French ended in 1942 and was switched to Spanish for the Hispanic war workers who'd been brought into Detroit to work in the many factories in the booming defense industry. All right? But that's on the Detroit side of the river. What you should know is that on the other side of the river, and here's a nice picture down below of that beautiful church from 1843, Assumption Parish, and in the background is the skyline of Detroit. Most people don't know that among the 300,000 people living in the greater Windsor area, about 3% of them speak French at home today. And in fact, there are about 8,000 of them. They have students in their own 3 different school districts. And in fact, they have a community college. Let's play a little more of our music here. They have a community college. There's French associations because of a large number of French-speaking immigrants coming to Canada from former French colonies in Africa and the Middle East. And there's a Résidence Richelieu, of which I'm a board member. It's an apartment complex for French-speaking seniors only. And there is a club like Lions or Rotary, a social called the Club Richelieu, which functions in French, and it's a sociable and charitable organization. There's a local Radio Canada that you can get on 1550 AM or 105 AM, anybody's interested. There's churches that do services in French in Windsor, Tecumseh, Rivière-Canard. And there's a weekly newspaper, Le Rompeur, which is a community newspaper, and it keeps everyone tied together. Even the French-speaking people who live in Detroit now, who are from France, working in the auto industry, and there are probably 4,000 or 5,000 of them, most of them aren't even aware that there are French-speaking people on the other side of the river. I'm active in this community. I'm one of the rare Americans that is. And, in fact, it's a great way, if you want to explore your French roots, you don't have to go to Montreal. You don't have to go to France. You can cross the bridge. And I take Americans over there all the time for the various events, and the French people in Windsor are ecstatically happy, welcoming Americans with open arms who are curious about the culture that still exists there. And they're especially happy when people with French names from Michigan come, who want to discover what their roots are all about. So keep in mind, there's 2 different stories, but they're connected. The cousins that still speak French on the Canadian side of the river, and the long assimilated Americans of French descent on the American side of the river. So the church on the other side of the river, as I mentioned, Assumption Church, and it was built in 1843, as old as anything in Detroit. And there's a wonderful painting somebody did here from back in the 1804. This painting is. That's one of the original churches, and in the background, it's what Detroit looked like before the Great Fire of 1805. So the 2 communities were linked. They were one and the same. It's just artificially we've drawn a line between them. On the American side of the river, we have a National Historic Landmark in the Basilica of St. Anne of Detroit. And this really is the last great monument that the French built, the landmark the French built, the French speakers of Detroit built. And they must have seen their assimilation on the horizon, but they invested in the future. They had a number of churches that succeeded each other in downtown Detroit. And the one they built in around 1820 was in bad condition in the 1880s, and the land, they couldn't expand. They needed more space. The land was worth a lot, so they sold the land downtown, and they moved out to what was way on the outside of town in the 1880s. And it's a beautiful church. I encourage any of you to come visit it. Elizabeth and I are active in Le Rendez-vous de Détroit, which has as its goal the raising of funds to save this national historic landmark. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Okay?
And I'd like to add about St. Anne's. St. Anne's was founded in 1701, of course, by Cadillac. The original structure was inside of a Fort Pontchartrain, but it is the second oldest continuously operating parish in the United States. And with the 1823 church, what they did was they moved the stained glass windows into the present church, along with the Beaubien bell and also the original altar. And so the oldest stained glass windows in Detroit are in the Basilica today. So if you ever want to see the oldest stained glass windows, please come to St. Anne's. They're beautiful.
It's a wonderful place that is Hispanic and English speaking, a mix of the two. And so when we've gotten involved there, we add the third language of French to really expose and show the rich heritage mosaic of the city of Detroit.
But every July they do have a French Mass. So they still do have many French events.
So I think another important person to point out, and now that we're talking about St. Anne's, 100 years after Cadillac was here, came a guy named Gabriel Richard. The name might ring a bell for a few of you from local high schools. There's Gabriel Richard Park right across the river from Belle Isle, along the bridge. And who was he? He was a refugee of the terror of the French Revolution, and he came to the United States in 1794. Of course, he was French, and it took him a few years to learn English, but eventually he was sent out to Detroit, where he was given responsibility eventually for the parish of St. Anne. But he did much more than that. In fact, he worked with his Presbyterian colleague and with Judge Woodward to create the University of Michigan. Whenever you see 1817 on the U of M sweatshirts, etc., keep in mind there's a French guy who was one of those three who started it. He brought in the first printing press to the territory of Michigan, printed the first newspaper. He was the first priest elected delegate to Congress and was elected overwhelmingly. Besides being St. Anne's, he was so well loved that when there was no Protestant minister available, he was called on to minister to non-Catholics, something that didn't happen back in the 1800s very much. Or he opened schools for natives. He died caring for victims of a cholera epidemic in 1832. And when he passed away, the entire state marked his passing. And he wrote the Detroit motto in Latin, which is still used today and still appropriate today. We hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes. And he wrote that after the 1805 fire, which destroyed almost the entire town at the time. So Gabriel Richard is a great hero for the city of Detroit. And he didn't come with Cadillac. He came 100 years later. So we have to talk about something else here, the French and the Indians. In fact, the word métis, or sometimes pronounced métis, either way is acceptable. The French Indian pretty much developed almost a unique culture of their own, and the métis means mix. Where are métis in today's culture, Elizabeth?
Well, the métis are still here, but I think I'm going to go back and tell them a little bit about the French Canadians and the Indians, because they had this wonderful, they were kind of masters of their universe, or their empire during the fur trade. It was quite common for Frenchmen to marry into Indian tribes, and this was very beneficial because, for one thing, they had protection, but also they could be a part of this kinship network that their wives could open them up to. And so, of course, the result of these marriages would be children that would be half French and part Indian, so there we have the métis. Also, Indians taught the French a lot of things about how to survive in Michigan and Canada, of course, and making maple syrup was one of them. The Indians always made maple syrup because this was their only sweetener. It's a great source of calcium. So they taught the French to make maple syrup. And of course, if you follow maple syrup industry, in Canada, they produce a vast majority of the world's maple syrup. Indians brought lacrosse, the game, wild rice, corn, and the Indians introduced moccasins, snowshoes, mittens, deer hunting, and ice fishing. The Europeans had never seen ice fishing before, and they were quite, interested in that. And so a lot of these things are still in our culture today. And in Métis families, they carried on these traditions. And in my family, one of my French ancestors married an Ojibwa from Mackinac Island. He was an interpreter and a guide known from Mackinac to Detroit. And so all of these Métis traditions were passed on. And John suggested that I share something with you. My grandfather, back in the 1940s, he was a deer hunter, and this is something that, came from his, Native American background, where the Indians, of course, they harvested deer not only to eat, but to use as clothing. And so my grandpa, was a deer hunter, and he had this beautiful coat made for my mom, and it's what was called an Eisenhower jacket. And then, kind of as a little salute to his French ancestry, he had this little beret made. So I think that was a very nice nod to both of his cultures.
Okay, we're going to have to move a little along here. What's of the French legacy at the Strait today? Well, we've got the dozen of French names. By the way, we have 4,000 citizens in the automotive world here, but there's also an upcoming merger of SCA, Fiat Chrysler, and PSA, the big French automotive, and their new name will encompass both and will be essentially a French global organization. We've got the French School, the Alliance Française of Detroit. I encourage any of you that want to take language lessons. The Grosse Pointe, the same. We have Cadillac statues, and we do the Rendez-vous with Detroit. And I mentioned about the 8,000 French speakers on the other side of the river. But we also have had a number of French events along the years, the last few years, as we try to rebirth the French history, which has been neglected for so long. And Nain Rouge is one of those, legendary French creature. And we have our own Detroit equivalent of Mardi Gras every year. And we've been doing that, making that part of the French culture here. And the red dwarf was the evil creature who's supposed to, his appearance is followed by catastrophes. So, we've been doing the Detroit French History Cruise now for a number of years on the river, 5 years. And we must also keep in mind, Detroit French pears actually were brought here by French Jesuit priests where they were crossed with a local variety. And now the special heritage pear is still available. And we're planning on doing a festival on that sometime in the near future. But we really want to focus on a little bit of time we have remaining on the Rendezvous of Detroit, Le Rendez-vous du Détroit. And our mission is to revive the knowledge and appreciation of the period of the French and Native peoples' mutually beneficial partnership in the time of the fur trade.
I think that what we found was that our French legacy and our history in Detroit was, really most people didn't really know about it. And so we developed the Rendezvous 4 years ago. We had to cancel this year's event because of COVID. But next year we're very excited because we're going to be holding it at historic Fort Lane, which is very appropriate because it's going to be right on the Detroit River. The ancient Indian burial mounds are there. It's also the site of a Potawatomi village that was there in the early 1700s when Cadillac founded Detroit. So that really is appropriate to celebrate both our Native American and our French Canadian heritage. And at the Rendezvous, we have, of course, lots of entertainment. You heard a little bit about from Marcel Beneteau. So we have French Canadian music and dancing. We have Native American music and dancing. We have artisans. We have 18th century children's games for the kids. We have a heritage tent with exhibits. We, of course, have French wine. We have French Canadian beer and cider. And we have raffles. We have reenactors. So it's really a very fun event. And, of course, you are all invited.
And you can see we've been able to get support from the French Diplomatic Corps locally here in Detroit, the Consul General for the Midwest, and we gave a tour to the new French ambassador from Detroit a couple of weeks ago. We have the Alliance Française, the French lady, a gourmet caterer. We had sponsorship from Cadillac's hometown in France, who helped us with a little token amount so that we could do this. We had the Quebec head of delegation for the Midwest come. So we're getting support for doing this. But what are our goals for the future? Well, one idea is to help Detroit in its renaissance is so that we can have some tangible understanding and proof that the French and Native Americans worked well together during the fur trade for a mutually beneficial commercial enterprise. And we'd like to do something like the 1701 trail, Fort Pontchartrain with Native American inhabitants there, something like Fort Michilimackinac on the right that you see up right next to the Mackinac Bridge in northern Michigan. We think that would be a great addition to attract families here into Detroit. We've got support for this idea from various people along the French community on both sides of the ocean. And I'd like to end up here with something that I think is appropriate. We're trying to empower the people of Detroit and the region and understand the benefit of their history. And one of the events done on the other side of the river with our friends in Windsor was a show called The Echo of a People, L'Echo d'un Peuple. And the final song is entitled here, you can read it, The Power of Detroit, La Puissance du Détroit. And I've translated some of the words here, and you can see that although these words and the sentiments go back centuries, we can all identify with overcoming the challenges of a cold winter. And working from Point Pelee and Lake St. Clair, the French are very proud of their role in helping the Underground Railroad cross river, helping escape slaves, and being a member of a three-century family. And the chorus, I think, is very appropriate. Long live our resilience and joy. The power of our ancestors are in me. From shore to shore and with you, we make the strait runneth over. And the strait is, of course, Detroit. So with that, we'd like to be open for any questions and encourage us all to take advantage of our own histories and see the values and the cultural inheritance that we all have. Sherry?
Awesome. Thank you so much, John and Elizabeth. That was a wonderful presentation. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and if you have any questions, please submit your questions in the chat function there. Elizabeth, someone said that is a beautiful coat. Do you mind sharing that coat one more time? I didn't get to catch it in its entirety.
Sure. I'll put my beret on. Yeah, I love this coat, too. You know, the funny thing that I didn't have time to say in the presentation was there was so much prejudice against Indians that my Indian heritage was completely hidden from me. The Métis people, they hid in plain sight. And so I didn't know about any of this until actually a few years ago after my mom died and I started doing some research. And then all of a sudden everything started to make sense to me because I thought that everybody's mom wore a deerskin jacket to the grocery store. And I found out that, yeah, I guess they didn't. But anyway, so here's my beret, and I don't know how much you can see, but...
Why don't you get it sit down?
Oh. Can you see it?
Awesome, yep, we saw you. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
I think you answered this, but just one more time. Someone asked, when is the Detroit Mardi Gras and the Detroit French River Cruise?
Okay, so normally we do the Detroit French River Cruise every June, and it's typically we'll do it on a Sunday afternoon maybe the second or third Sunday. So, of course, we had to cancel it for this year. The proceeds from that cruise, organized by the Alliance Française, in fact, the proceeds go to finance another cruise, which is only for school kids, high schoolers especially, who are studying the French language. And their French teachers really enjoy the opportunity to show their French students, the students of the French language, that they don't have to go all the way to Paris or Montreal to understand any French history. They have it here. We have it here. So that's done in June, second or third Sunday in June, and then the school version is done usually on a Monday in May. And if anybody wants to contact me, I'm always looking. I'm looking to change over schools every year so that more schools get exposed to this. We usually get a mix of city schools and suburban schools, and we always have a more than enough, but I'd like to get new schools involved. So that's for the cruise. The other one was for the Mardi Gras. In fact, it's the Nain Rouge, or the Nain Rouge as some people call it, but okay, the French pronunciation is Nain Rouge. That takes place in March. We don't organize it, we're part of it. That's organized by the Midtown Detroit Merchants Association. It's supported by them, and there is a special group that Elizabeth and I have helped out with, and it's the Nain Rouge, and there are people, really creative artist people, who put together these wild costumes. It looks like Rio de Janeiro at carnival time, but it's not Mardi Gras. It is the ceremony and a parade to banish the Nain Rouge for another 12 months, so catastrophe does not befall the city of Detroit again. The story is that Nain Rouge was spotted just before Cadillac left town, and then he was spotted again just before the big fire of 1805, and then he was spotted again before the 1967. And so this is a wonderful thing that they've been running now for 12 years, and I'd encourage anybody to come down to it. It may not look like it when you get a glimpse, but it's a wonderful family event, and we're down there with horse and carriage every year, putting the French stamp of approval on it.
And the people are the parade,
yes,
which makes it very fun.
Yeah. So don't come to watch the parade. Come to march in it.
You're going to be in it. Yeah.
It's a wonderful event.
And I'd also like to add, speaking about language, the Rendezvous that we have is also a bilingual event. So we do market it to French teachers, French students, and French speakers, of course. So you don't have to go anywhere to be in a situation where all the signage, John does the emceeing for the program, so that's also bilingual. So it's a real good opportunity.
So if any of your people, the employees watching, have French students, kids in French classes, whatever, have them encourage their teachers to get in touch with the Alliance Française, or especially le Rendez-vous de Détroit. We'll steer them in the right direction. You can get us on the Alliance Française website.
And we're on Facebook.
And on Facebook.
Awesome. Another question was, who lived in the fort?
Who lived in the fort? Good question. At the beginning, everybody lived in the fort when they felt they needed protection. And so for the first few years, there were French arrived, and the Indians had their own villages, and their villages, interestingly enough, also had walls around there, palisades, that actually made them look a good bit like a European fort. They would cut down trees and then clean off the logs and make a palisade, because the Indians wanted protection as well. But they usually kept them separately. Sometimes they were close by with a few teepees like you saw in that rendering. But the main village was maybe like a mile or two away, so that it was close enough to trade, but far enough away that they didn't step on each other's feet. One of the interesting stories was when the French brought pigs to Detroit for the first time. The Indians hadn't had them. They didn't have them, and pigs will eat anything, and they will dig it up. And so the pigs started to dig up the Indian vegetable gardens and dig up the carrots and the potatoes, etc. And so the French decided to be good neighbors, they put the pigs on what is Belle Isle today. The original name of Belle Isle was Hog Island. And it's because the French put the pigs there so they wouldn't eat up their Indian neighbors' gardens. And it's a long story. You can hear it when I do my Detroit French history cruise. But the fort quickly, number of people outgrew it, and even by 1710, the walls of the fort were almost falling down by themselves. They rotted, etc. And so later it grew and got bigger, and then the British took over, and they made the fort separate. It couldn't encompass everything, but eventually the number of people expanded, and it expanded out into the ribbon farms that Elizabeth explained about.
Awesome. Thank you. And also thank you for bringing up Belle Isle. Someone did have a question about Belle Isle. So they'll have to come to the cruise to get more of the history on that.
I'll answer that question. It was, although the name is French, it was in fact Augustus Woodward, the Woodward family. He bought the island in the middle 1800s, and he wanted to change the name from Hog Island, and so he named it after his daughter Belle. So Woodward didn't even, well, I'm sure he spoke French because you couldn't really live in Detroit in those days without speaking French. But his daughter's name was Belle, and he renamed the island after his daughter. The French didn't name it Belle Isle.
Does Detroit have a connection to Quebec City?
Yes, because in fact Cadillac came from Montreal, and in those days, in 1701, Montreal was growing in importance. Quebec was the first place in Quebec City, the capital of Quebec. Quebec means literally where the waters open. I used to live in Quebec, and not the city, but in Montreal, and in fact, Quebec was the administrative head of New France, when later Montreal became bigger. Under Catholic terms, Detroit was part of the Quebec diocese until about 1800. So, yes, there were connections, and you got to remember, there's Quebec City, and then there's the province of Quebec, and those are two different things. It's like New York City and New York State. All right, the province of Quebec is huge. Quebec City is a beautiful place. For those of you who haven't had a chance to go to Europe, we strongly encourage you, go to Quebec City. It's only, 12 hours away by car, and it's just like going to Europe. And I know because I've lived in both places. So Quebec City is a wonderful place. Montreal is much bigger. It's really interesting. It's really cool. It feels more North American. Quebec City feels like you're really in Europe. But both places are wonderful, but for two different reasons. And they're both in the province of Quebec. They're about 2 hours apart. Montreal's the closer one, and it's only about, 6 hours the other side of Toronto.
Awesome. Someone asked, did we wind up with Louisiana Purchase from France or England?
Louisiana Purchase was from France, and interestingly enough, there's a Detroit connection there because after he was head of Detroit for about 10 years, Cadillac got in some political trouble, and he got promoted out of Detroit to be governor of Louisiana. And Louisiana in those days wasn't just the state of Louisiana. Louisiana was everything west of the Mississippi going to the Rocky Mountains. It was huge. It was huge. Of course, the French were very few and only in a few places along the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, and especially at New Orleans. Okay? So, later on, in 1802, Louisiana Purchase, if I'm not mistaken, 1803, Napoleon was in a bit of trouble in Europe. He was having all of his wars with all the different royal kingdoms who didn't like him being non-royal, though he was quite an emperor himself. He decided these Americans are getting pretty strong. Either my enemies, the British, are going to take Louisiana, or the Americans are eventually going to absorb it. So I might as well sell it now while I can. So he sold it for $25 million, which was a lot of money in those days, but when you look at it per acre, it was really, really cheap, and a lot of the French complained, why did Napoleon sell Louisiana? Well, he would have lost it anyway. The British would have taken it from him in the meantime, And Napoleon, of course, he lost at Waterloo. They would have lost all their things then. So Louisiana had Cadillac as a governor for 4 or 5 years, I believe, after he left Detroit. And that's why there's Fort Pontchartrain in Detroit, and there's Lake Pontchartrain just outside of New Orleans. Cadillac named both of them. He wanted to please his boss back in Paris.
Awesome. Thank you. We have a few employees that have French background history. A lot of thank yous for doing this session. My husband's family is French Canadians back in the mid-1600s, original settlers in Detroit with Cadillac. This has been eye-opening for me. Someone else said this was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Can't wait to see more. Someone asked, will this session be recorded? It will be recorded, and we will also post it on our DNI SharePoint site. They said that they would love to go back and revisit all of this wonderful history that you gave us today. Someone also said that they grew up on St. Albany Street in the 70s and the 80s.
Cool.
Another question is St. B. Anne always open to the public?
St. Anne?
St. Anne?
Yes.
Well, it's open. It's not open 24 hours a day, but if you come on a Sunday or a Saturday during the services or between services, where the church is very happy to have you. Elizabeth and I have both given tours there. And in fact, when the French ambassador came for his first visit to Detroit a month ago, his assistant there, who's in charge of the Midwest, said, I want his tour to start at St. Anne's because that's the anchor point. It is a beautiful church with the oldest stained glass in Detroit, and the Basilica is a wonderful place. It's open on Sundays, and there are tours that are done usually, outside of COVID times, there are usually tours done every week. You can call up the rectory and arrange for a tour time, or you can contact me. I'm happy to help people set this up, and they love to have people down there.
Actually, and next year when we have the rendezvous at historic Fort Wayne, we are going to have a shuttle bus that will take people to St. Anne's for tours as well, because that's just such a vital part of our history.
Awesome. A lot of comments are coming in just saying, fantastic presentation, wonderful. Thank you so much, DNI, for bringing this to us. I learned so much and want to share with others. One last question, because we're almost at 1 o'clock, and if you have to log off and your employees need to log off, that's fine. We will take a couple of more questions. But a question that did come in is, are there any Native American tribes still located in the certain areas these days? I would love to visit with my family.
Yes, there are Native American tribes in the area.
Well, yes, there are. Did you want to take
No, you go ahead. That's your blood.
Right. Well, that depends. There are a number of Native American associations in the Metro Detroit area. A very fascinating place to go and visit is the Zibowing Center up at Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and that is about Anishinaabe culture. There's so many tribes. It just depends on which tribe you're with. So
the Hurons, Wyandots, that's the same thing. Hurons and Wyandots are the same. Are developing their own space down in Gibraltar, Michigan. And they hope to make a tourist center out of it right off of I-75. And we have they're cooperating with us. They're part of our rendezvous for this coming year. So there's a number of different organizations that you can be connected with, and it's all usually done by nation tribe.
And what's interesting about the Zibowing Center up in Mount Pleasant, they actually have a genealogy center there where they have rolls where your ancestors, if you do have Native American ancestry, they have rolls there. You can also get online and check your family lineage. There's the Durant rolls. So it just depends on which tribe you're affiliated with. Does that help?
Yes. Awesome.
Great.
Well,
Charlie, let's see if Rick wants to provide any closing comments if he's still on. I think Rick is still on the line. Okay, maybe he stepped away. So sorry, you can go ahead and thank you, John and Elizabeth. Great session. Really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. We hope to see you as many as possible at at the cultural event at Historic Fort Wayne next year, 1st of August, 2021, on a Sunday afternoon, family event. Bring one, bring all.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much for your time and attention. Merci.
Excellent.
Au revoir. Bientôt.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
All right. Au revoir.
Thank you, Sherry.
You're welcome.
Let's wipe a little